Today we're jumping straight into what feels, I think, like the political equivalent of a great tragedy.
Hmm.
It's the story of a powerful, seemingly unassailable leader who, after defeating every enemy you could imagine, was ultimately, well, undone by her closest colleagues. We are deep diving into the sudden, tearful, and profoundly dramatic downfall of Margaret Thatcher.
It is, without a doubt, one of the most phenomenal political exits of the 20th century. I mean, think about it. Here you have a prime minister, Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady.
The Iron Lady, exactly.
She led Britain through a war in the Falklands. She had fought and, won this huge battle against the trade unions, and she'd steered her party to 3 consecutive election victories.
3. A rare feat?
A very rare feat. And yet, on November 22nd, 1990, she was pushed out of office, not by the opposition, not by the voters, but by her own conservative party.
By her own people.
The very party she had dominated for 11 and a half years. It's just extraordinary.
And that final moment of her departure is, it's just burned into the political memory of the country, isn't it? You can picture it so clearly. The motorcade, the huge press pack, the crowds gathered outside 10 Downing Street.
Mm-hmm.
And then you see Thatcher, visibly close to tears, standing there with her husband, Dennis, and she's delivering a statement that was somehow both triumphant and, well, heartbreaking.
It was. She said, "We're leaving Downing Street for the last time after 11 and a half wonderful years, and we're happy to leave the UK in a very, very much better state than when we came here."
That one line, that scene, it just perfectly captures the core contradiction of her exit,
It really does, because on one hand, she departed with this absolute conviction that she had succeeded, that she had transformed the nation and left it stronger on the world stage. But on the other hand, she just looked crushed, overwhelmed, and profoundly, deeply betrayed.
Right. So the mission of this deep dive really is to answer that fundamental question. How does someone so formidable, someone who genuinely felt she was leaving the country at a better state, lose what she called the ultimate fight with her own party?
And we're going to peel back the layers on what is, at its heart, a classic political saga. It's about hubris, it's about accumulated resentment, and it's about the brutal efficiency of political maneuvering.
And for this, we're drawing on some really detailed recollections, aren't we? From the ministers who were actually in the room, the ones who advised her to quit.
Yes, and the civil servants who witnessed those final emotional moments, plus Thatcher's own analysis after the fact, which is, as you can imagine, incredibly revealing.
What the sources make clear then is that this wasn't some sudden collapse. It wasn't a single event.
No, not at all. It was a slow erosion of loyalty. It was a cumulative failure where her greatest strengths, her absolute certainty, her sheer force of will eventually became her most devastating liabilities.
So this deep dive is your shortcut to understanding precisely how a figure who fought the world was ultimately felled by her own team in what she would later famously call treachery with a smile on its face.
That phrase says it all.
It really does. Okay, so let's unpack this. To really get the depth of that betrayal, we have to start with the style that made her the Iron Lady in the first place. This management style that wasn't just effective, it was intentionally intimidating.
Absolutely. The Thatcher style was not an accident. It was a conscious choice, and it was designed to ensure ministerial compliance and, maybe more importantly, to prevent the sort of mushy consensus politics that she just detested.
She hated that idea of compromise for its own sake.
Despised it. She believed that power had to be exercised, visibly, unequivocally. You had to know who was in charge.
Former Minister Chris Patten, he gave one of the most candid descriptions of this, didn't he? He suggested that Thatcher understood that if you really want to get your own way, people need to be, and this is his quote, a bit scared of you.
And that's a fundamentally different approach to cabinet government, isn't it? It runs directly counter to the whole idea of collective responsibility, of a meeting of equals.
So how did she justify that? In her own mind.
She justified it based on intellectual rigor. She often described her own process in almost scientific terms. She saw her job as gathering all the information, rigorously weighing the data, and then she would deliver the verdict.
The verdict. Not a proposal.
Exactly. To her, disagreement wasn't really legitimate dissent. It was just an intellectual deficiency on your part. You simply hadn't understood the facts as well as she had.
And she said as much herself. There's that famous quote where she says, "I think sometimes the prime minister should be intimidating. There's not much point being a weak, floppy thing in the chair, is there?
Right. That certainty, that absolute conviction that she alone held the singular correct answer, it just alienated so many people who genuinely felt they had valuable expertise to contribute. It wasn't a conversation, it was a lecture.
It sounds less like a colleague and more like a, I don't know, a headmistress. The psychological toll of working under that kind of constant pressure must have been immense.
It was. And again, it's Chris Patton who gave us the most memorable analogy for that environment. He called it the anaconda in the chandelier.
The anaconda in the chandelier. Wow. That is an instantly terrifying image.
It speaks volumes, doesn't it? It's that constant low-level sense of fear, the pressure that if you got things wrong, if your arguments weren't completely watertight, that power could just drop down at any moment and strangle your policy, your argument, or even your career.
So how did that manifest in, say, a cabinet meeting?
Well, often she would begin the meeting by summarizing what she believed the cabinet's conclusions should be.
At the beginning of the meeting.
At the beginning. And then she would effectively challenge them to prove her wrong. The entire structure was designed not for debate, but for validation of a preformed conclusion.
And the incredible irony, which we mentioned at the start, is just so stark. That very style, that regal management, as some called it, it created this huge, deep reservoir of silent dissent and personal grievance. And when the moment finally came, all that resentment just flowed directly into the political challenge.
Her style bred a kind of loyalty that was rooted in, well, career survival rather than genuine political alignment. But fear on its own doesn't trigger a coup. It just suppresses dissent for a while.
Right. You need a crack to appear.
You need a crack. To break through that fear, a major political vulnerability had to emerge. And that vulnerability appeared almost immediately after her highest point winning that rare third term in 1987. It was then that her leadership was, quote, in question for the first time.
And the immediate policy that triggered this fracture was, of course, the introduction of the controversial community charge, which everyone came to know as the poll tax.
This was the first seismic political miscalculation of her third term. The community charge, or poll tax, was a flat-rate local council levy. It was applied to every adult resident in a district.
Regardless of their income.
Regardless of their income or the value of their property. The theory behind it was ideologically pure Thatcherism.
Which was?
The idea was that if everyone paid something towards local services, it would foster greater accountability. If everyone had, skin in the game, everyone would care about how their local council was spending money.
But the reality on the ground was politically explosive. It literally meant that a duke in a castle paid the same amount as a ditch digger in a bedsit. It was seen as just profoundly unfair.
Exactly. Not just unfair, but actively regressive. And the consequences were instant, and they were very visible. We saw massive protests, public disobedience, culminating in the infamous riots in London's Trafalgar Square in March 1990.
And for Tory members of Parliament, this wasn't just an abstract ideological point anymore. It became an existential threat.
It was a direct threat to their jobs, their constituents. People who had supported them for years were suddenly facing huge increases in their local tax bills. And they were terrified that the poll tax would directly cost them their seats. They could see a Labour landslide on the horizon.
So the poll tax basically erodes her public popularity, and it gives her MPs a very concrete, very selfish reason to start questioning her. It weakened that whole facade of unassailability.
Precisely. It was the catalyst. It was the first time the party started to think they could actually lose an election with her at the helm. However, and this is a really vital distinction to make, while the poll tax weakened her, it was specifically the issue of the UK's relationship with Europe that would bring about her eventual downfall.
Right, so the political mechanism of leadership contest was triggered by Europe, not by local council fees.
Correct. The ground was softened by the poll tax, but the explosive charge, the thing that actually set it all off, was Europe.
And the person who lit the fuse, incredibly, was not some hard-charging rival. It was the mild-mannered former Chancellor and Foreign Secretary, Sir Geoffrey Howe.
This is truly a study in how the most unassuming figures can become the most devastating political antagonists. Sir Geoffrey Howe was known, quite frankly, for being one of the least charismatic people in Parliament.
That's putting it mildly.
I mean, his reputation was famously crystallized by a Labour MP back in 1978 who said that a rhetorical attack from him was like being savaged by a dead sheep.
Being savaged by a dead sheep. That is a quote that should have been utterly disabling for a politician, shouldn't it? Yet he managed to deliver this killer blow. How?
He had a secret weapon, which was substance and tenacity. Howe himself was aware of his reputation for being a bit dull, but he characterized his own style as one of tenacious repetition.
I like that. Tenacious repetition.
He didn't rely on bombast or shouting matches. He relied on quiet, consistent pressure, just detailing facts and figures and repeating his point until it was accepted. He once called himself a quiet, consistent badger.
A quiet, consistent badger. I love these animal analogies.
He said he didn't necessarily enjoy the political rough and tumble, but he persisted. He just kept going.
And Thatcher, who really only respected immediate force and, quick, punchy delivery, she just completely underestimated this quiet badger.
She did. It was a fatal misjudgment. She mistook his mild manner for weakness. She thought that if you weren't loud and certain, you weren't really a threat. But Howe had been a key ally in her early years. He was her first chancellor, then her foreign secretary. The slow, painful breakdown of that relationship is where the eventual betrayal was really rooted.
So tell us about that breakdown. When did the sidelining really begin?
It all came to a head with the 1989 cabinet reshuffle. This was Thatcher trying to shore up her power, moving ministers around who she felt were becoming too independent or too pro-European.
And Howe was moved from the Foreign Office.
Yes, he was replaced as foreign secretary by the rising star John Major. Now, that was a demotion in itself, but the real insult, the real public slight, was his new role, deputy prime minister.
Which cabinet colleague Kenneth Baker described as a complete non-job, didn't he? He equated it to being the vice president of the United States.
Exactly. It was a title with no real power. It had no department, no policy mandate. It was widely seen as a sort of holding pen for a troublesome grandee you didn't know what to do with, and Howe absolutely knew he was being sidelined.
And in the fiercely hierarchical world of Westminster, being sidelined like that is seen as a profound disrespect.
It is. Thatcher thought she had neutralized him. But instead, what she'd done was give a quietly resentful, highly intelligent man a lot of time to think about his next move.
So we have the perfect recipe brewing. A deeply respected, long-serving minister full of professional resentment, just waiting for a defining issue to act on. And that issue, of course, was Europe.
The flashpoint came in late 1990. Brussels was pressing really hard for greater economic and monetary union. There were serious discussions about a single currency, about transferring more fiscal control to the center.
And for Howe, who is generally a pro-European, this represented the future.
Right. He believed Britain's destiny lay inside Europe, shaping these institutions. But for Thatcher, it represented a fundamental assault on British sovereignty. It was the potential end of everything she believed she'd achieved.
And this huge ideological conflict culminated in her delivering that infamous, definitive soundbite in Parliament on October 30th, 1990.
Oh, the scene was pure political drama. She was at the dispatch box discussing the push for a more federal Europe, and she just unleashed her fury against her European counterparts with this defiant, shouted triple denial that electrified the House of Commons.
The famous no, no, no.
No, no, no. It was a declaration of war, really.
And that aggressive public finality, just slamming the door on any kind of diplomatic maneuvering, that was too much for Sir Geoffrey Howe.
It was the explicit rejection of everything he had tried to achieve as foreign secretary. It was the final dismissal of his authority on the European file. And he resigned his post just 2 days later. What followed, though, was a masterclass in a rhetorical strategy that shifted the entire political landscape in the space of about 15 minutes.
This is where the story shifts from that quiet maneuvering to, outright public warfare. But it was fought entirely through these wonderful analogies.
It was. Thatcher, who remained completely bullish, she responded to Howe's resignation at the annual Lord Mayor's banquet on November 12th. And she used the occasion to declare she was fighting on, using a series of really combative cricket metaphors.
She's trying to frame the situation as this personal fight she was destined to win, using language that she knew would play to the patriotic, sporting instincts of her core supporters.
Exactly. She stood up and declared, "I'm still at the crease, though the bowling's been pretty hostile of late." She's the stalwart batsman holding the line against all comers.
And she didn't just promise resilience, she promised aggression. She made it clear she viewed the opposition as bowling bouncers, these fast, dangerous balls aimed right at the head.
Yes, she continued. And in case anyone doubted it, can I assure you there will be no ducking the bouncers, no stonewalling, no playing for time. The bowling's going to get hit all around the ground. That's my style.
It's a superb, powerful statement of intent. But ironically, that very confidence, that very specific analogy, was the thing that made her so vulnerable.
It allowed Howe the perfect, custom-made rhetorical framework for his devastating reply.
Right. Howe's resignation speech, delivered the very next day in Parliament, is consistently cited as one of the greatest in British political history. So how did the dead sheep manage to turn those cricket metaphors against the Prime Minister with such lethal precision?
Well, he took her analogy and he just completely reversed its meaning. It was genius. He described Thatcher's behavior towards her own European negotiators, people like him, the opening batsman, as undermining them through her own rigid certainty.
He said it was rather like sending your opening batsman to the crease only to find that their bats have been broken before the game by the team captain.
Ouch. I mean, can you imagine being in the chamber when he said that?
Just incredible. That changes the narrative completely.
Yeah.
From heroic fighting to deliberate sabotage of her own team. It implies she wasn't leading Britain, she was destroying Britain's ability to negotiate effectively.
And it was politically lethal because it hit multiple points of resentment all at once. It didn't just speak to the pro-Europeans in the party. It validated every single minister who had ever felt they'd been undermined or shouted down or had their own policy efforts crippled by Thatcher's personal veto. The speech was calm, it was methodical, but the content was absolutely explosive.
And Howe didn't stop there, did he?
Yeah.
He concluded with what was, for all intents and purposes, an explicit invitation for a challenge. The clearest signal a parliamentarian can give without actually naming someone.
He did. He concluded by saying that every minister needed to consider their loyalty, stating, "The time has come for others to consider their own response to the tragic conflict of loyalties with which I have myself wrestled for perhaps too long."
Wow, that's not subtle.
Not at all. He was holding the door wide open. He was saying, "I've done my part, now it's up to you." He had prepared the ground, he had provided the moral and political justification, and he had effectively fired the starting gun.
And that adversary, who had been waiting for 4 long years in political exile, immediately accepted the invitation. Enter Michael Heseltine.
Tarzan, the flamboyant, imposing, and aggressively pro-European challenger who had spent all that time away from the front benches, just waiting for the perfect moment to strike.
We should probably explain the Tarzan nickname. It's not one you hear every day in politics.
No. It came from a dramatic incident in the House of Commons back in 1976 when he, in a fit of theatrical rage, grabbed the ceremonial mace and started waving it at the opposition benches.
So that suggests a man of immense physical presence and flair. He was really the complete antithesis of the cerebral, methodical Thatcher, wasn't he?
In terms of style, he was everything she wasn't. Tall, that famous head of hair, impeccably coiffed, and very theatrical. But critically, his policy differences were profound, especially on Europe. He was a committed integrationist. He believed the UK should be at the very heart of European political and economic development.
So his challenge wasn't just personal ambition. It was a fundamental policy split that spoke directly to the fears of the moderate conservative wing that Howe had just mobilized with his speech.
Precisely. And let's not forget, Heseltine had his own history with her. He'd resigned 4 years earlier as defense secretary because he felt Thatcher was ignoring his advice over the Westland helicopter affair.
So both of the main antagonists, Howe, the quiet assassin, and Heseltine, the challenger, were motivated by years of accumulated personal and professional slight.
Exactly. Heseltine's entry shifted the contest from a question of if Thatcher should go to who should replace her. He was the credible, visible, and charismatic alternative that the party needed to feel comfortable actually mounting a challenge. The clock was now ticking very loudly on the Thatcher era.
Okay, so now we enter the final frantic days. And this is where Thatcher, despite all her experience, made what so many analysts now see as a crucial, fatal, strategic misstep in how she handled the leadership contest.
I suppose the sheer arrogance of her position blinded her to the necessity of internal party politics. The first round of voting was imminent, and on the very day of the vote, what does Thatcher do? She chooses to travel to Paris for a major summit marking the end of the Cold War.
She prioritized the global stage over the parliamentary lobby.
She did. She was there, negotiating with world leaders, looking prime ministerial, while her challenger, Heseltine, was back in Westminster, in the corridors of power, schmoozing the doubters and hoovering up votes.
It seems like such a catastrophic error of judgment in hindsight.
It was. She completely failed to calculate that securing her own base at that precise moment was far more important than maintaining her global stature. The results of that first round were announced while she was still abroad, and they were devastating to her authority, even though she technically received the most votes.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of that vote, because this is often simplified. She defeated Heseltine, 204 votes to 152. On the face of it, that looks like a victory. Why wasn't it?
because of the specific and very demanding Conservative Party rules for leadership challenges at the time. To win outright on the first ballot and avoid a second round, a candidate needed two things: a clear majority of all eligible MPs, which she got, and a 15% margin over her closest challenger.
And she failed to clear that 15% margin. That number was the critical indicator of her loss of control.
Correct. She was just 4 votes short of that threshold. But it was enough. It signaled to everyone that a massive bloc of her own party, 152, for Heseltine and 16 who abstained or spoiled their ballots, was determined to get rid of her. For a sitting prime minister to be challenged like that, it just sank her authority and forced that dreaded second round.
And despite all the pressure, Thatcher flies back to London and defiantly pledges, "I fight on, I fight to win." But the momentum was just irreversibly against her by this point, wasn't it?
It was. And this leads us to the quiet, devastating series of meetings where her own cabinet delivered the final blow.
And her strategic failure was compounded here, wasn't it? By her decision-making upon her return.
Yes. Instead of calling a big supportive rally or working the phones relentlessly, she chose to assess her support by summoning her cabinet ministers to 10 Downing Street individually.
One by one.
One by one. This was supposed to be a way to gauge their loyalty, to look them in the eye, but it backfired spectacularly.
Because it created the perfect environment for them to coordinate. As the ministers were waiting outside her office, they chatted among themselves, and they realized they were all reading the same tea leaves. They were all coming to the same conclusion.
They reached a devastating consensus. For the good of the party, for their electoral survival, she had to stand down.
This is the very essence of that phrase, treachery with a smile.
Hmm.
They weren't going in to deliver policy advice. They were going in to deliver a verdict on her political viability.
Yes. They knew she likely couldn't win the second ballot, especially as other candidates like John Major and Douglas Hurd were now planning to enter the race, splitting her vote. They knew one of them stood a better chance of uniting the party and beating Heseltine.
I have to challenge the framing here slightly. I mean, was it truly treachery? Or is it just cynical pragmatism? Were they betraying her, the individual leader, or were they prioritizing the survival of the conservative government and, let's be honest, their own careers?
That is the defining question, isn't it? And the sources suggest it was a devastating blend of both. For Thatcher, of course, it felt like the ultimate treachery. These were her appointees, the beneficiaries of her power. But for them, it was framed as necessary, if painful, pragmatism. And they delivered the message in a way that was so devastatingly polite, it removed any grounds for her to accuse them of personal malice.
What was the precise, chillingly uniform message that she recounted later?
She described this painful experience 3 years later, talking about how, one after another, her ministers delivered the exact same lines. It was clearly rehearsed.
What did they say?
They'd come in and say, "Of course, Prime Minister, if you wish to stand, I'll support you, but I don't think you can win. And I think, therefore, you should let other people stand and you should stand down."
Wow. They twisted the knife by offering this continued but totally meaningless support, only if she chose to ignore their primary unanimous advice.
Exactly. They weren't telling her she was wrong on Europe or the poll tax anymore. The argument was over. They were just telling her she was beatable, that she had become a liability.
And that, for a leader whose entire identity was built on winning, must have been the ultimate humiliation.
It was. Having received that brutal consensus advice, Thatcher, who famously only ever needed about 4 hours of sleep a night, chose to sleep on the decision. She knew the game was up, but she needed to process the stark reality of her isolation.
The next morning at the cabinet meeting, she announced her decision to leave. This transition from that ruthless political killing to, well, genuine human emotion must have been incredibly jarring for everyone in that room.
It was profoundly emotional, even for the most pragmatic of her colleagues. A civil servant, Caroline Slowcock, who was present in the room taking notes, provided this heartbreaking account of the scene. She described Thatcher, just one woman surrounded by all these men, beginning to read a short, formal statement announcing her resignation.
And Slowcock described the Iron Lady just breaking down.
Yes! She started to cry and then she began to sob. Slowcock said she was really struggling to get the words out. It was the ultimate display of personal vulnerability from a woman who had projected nothing but iron will for over a decade. She was publicly weeping over the collapse of her political life.
And the response from the ministers. The very men who had just delivered the bad news.
Some of them were also wiping away tears, and this is the part where the pragmatism and the sentimentality just collide in this very strange way. Because Chris Patton, the same minister who described the anaconda in the chandelier, delivered this memorable, incredibly cynical commentary on the scene.
What did he say?
He said, "I think we all know that quite a lot of crocodiles keep a handkerchief handy."
Crocodile tears. Ouch. So they felt sorrow for the personal tragedy, but they also felt relief for the political opportunity.
The tears were real, I think, but so was the necessity of the political agenda they had just executed. That ambiguity really defines the end of the Thatcher era. It was a mixture of genuine sadness for the immense contribution she had made, coupled with the immense relief that they had removed an electoral liability and perhaps a very overbearing boss.
So after the tears and that incredibly emotional cabinet meeting, the transfer of power moves very swiftly to the second ballot.
Yes, Thatcher immediately pledged her full support to John Major, her former chancellor and foreign secretary. She was signaling to her loyalists that he was her chosen successor, the one to stop Heseltine.
And he did.
He did. Major saw off the challenges in the second ballot from Heseltine and Douglas Hurd, and he became the new conservative leader on November 27th.
And the next day, November 28th, 1990, she makes her final public departure as prime minister.
That familiar journey up to Buckingham Palace for one last audience with Queen Elizabeth II to formally tender her resignation, and then that iconic final wave goodbye outside Downing Street before the car drove her away.
And despite the massive personal trauma, her innate work ethic remained completely intact.
Absolutely. After moving her things out of Downing Street, she insisted she would be back in Parliament the very next morning, albeit with a longer commute from her new home in Dulwich, because, as she put it, work was the only thing she knew.
However, while she publicly endorsed Major, the sources make it very clear that she wasn't a quiet figure in the background, was she? She remained a powerful presence who refused to just disappear.
Not at all. She became what many called a very good backseat driver in the years that followed. She often made life very difficult for him. The emotional wound was just too deep. She saw Major's subsequent policies, particularly his more conciliatory approach to Europe, as a betrayal of her legacy. And she felt no hesitation in criticizing him from the backbenches.
She just couldn't relinquish her influence or her grievances.
No, her sense of betrayal against the party apparatus that had ejected her was all-consuming.
And that sense of betrayal, that core wound we started this whole deep dive with, it never healed, did it? For the rest of her life.
Never. The core takeaway from all our sources is that Thatcher never, ever reconciled herself with the manner of her departure. It wasn't the opposition who had beaten her in an election, it was her own side that had disposed of her. That internal wound remained open, and we really have to remember her final verdict on it, delivered 3 years later in 1993, which provides the definitive summary of this entire political saga.
What did she say?
She said, "It was treachery with a smile on its face." Perhaps that was the worst thing of all.
Treachery with a smile on its face. That phrase just perfectly encapsulates the nature of modern political execution, doesn't it? It's done not with daggers in the dark, but with polite, pragmatic advice delivered by smiling colleagues, framed as acting for the greater good.
It's the political equivalent of being told by your board that you've done excellent work and we're very grateful, but you've become a brand liability. The polite compliment somehow makes the dismissal sting even more sharply.
So let's quickly consolidate the key insights here, the anatomy of this political downfall for you, the learner. We've seen how 3 specific accumulated factors converged to fell the seemingly unassailable Iron Lady.
First, you had the specific policy failure, the poll tax. That provided the crucial existential motivation for Tory MPs to fear for their jobs, which completely weakened her external support.
Right. And second, there was her long-standing, increasingly arrogant style of regal management, that anaconda analogy, that fostered the deep, silent resentment among her own ministers that was necessary for them to act.
And finally, you had the European flashpoint. That provided the perfect, clear ideological justification. And it allowed the quietest, mildest-mannered man in her cabinet, Sir Geoffrey Howe, to deliver the devastating rhetorical catalyst, that broken bats speech, which explicitly signaled that the time for a challenge had come.
And that strategic invitation instantly brought back the perfect alternative candidate, Michael Heseltine, who was ready and waiting with a clear alternative vision for the party's future. It really is a masterclass in how rigid personal style, a failed policy, and timely rhetoric can combine to erode even the strongest political foundation.
What stands out to me in all this detail is the strategic power of the underestimated individual. The quiet, consistent badger who uses tenacity and timing rather than flair and bombast.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it? That often the person who delivers the most devastating political blow isn't the main challenger, the obvious rival like Heseltine, but the former mild-mannered ally like Sir Geoffrey Howe, the one whose long-simmering resentment provides the necessary moral and rhetorical justification for the palace coup.
Absolutely.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you to consider as you digest all this history. We've seen that the signal for power to change often comes not from the front lines, but from a former friend in a seemingly sidelined role.
So, as you look around at contemporary political landscapes, whether it's in national government or in corporate structures or even nonprofits, we encourage you to consider this. Which seemingly sidelined figures, those given non-jobs or dismissed as mild-mannered, might be today's quiet, consistent badger.
Who is waiting in the wings, armed with detailed, quiet knowledge and a profound sense of grievance, just waiting for the perfect rhetorical signal to challenge authority.
That dynamic, the patient, calculated vengeance of the dismissed ally, is what you should be watching for the next time political power seems absolute. That, I think, is the true lesson of Thatcher's downfall.
Food for thought indeed. We hope this deep dive has given you a thorough, detailed understanding of one of history's most fascinating political betrayals. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.